The last thing my grandfather ever gave me was a tin of shortbread cookies, not money, not jewelry. Not the lake house in Muskoka that my aunt had been circling for years like a vulture waiting out a storm. A tin of shortbread cookies with a faded tartan lid, the kind you find at every Shoppers Drug Mart in December for $12. My aunt snatched it out of my hands before I even got to open it. "He wouldn't have wanted you to have that," she said. Just like that. Flat. No explanation. She set it on the kitchen counter next to the sympathy cards and the casserole dishes people had dropped off, and she walked away. I was 28 years old, and I had just buried the only person in my family who had ever treated me like I mattered, and I stood in my grandfather's kitchen in Barrie, Ontario, holding nothing, while my aunt redistributed his entire life around me. Let me back up. My grandfather, I'll call him Grandpa Lou, raised me from the time I was 11. My mother, his daughter, had her own problems that I won't get into here, and my father had been gone since I was 7. So it was Grandpa Lou who came to my school concerts. Grandpa Lou who taught me to drive in an empty Canadian Tire parking lot on a Sunday morning. Grandpa Lou who sat across from me at the kitchen table every night and asked me what I thought about things, like my opinion was worth hearing. He never remarried after my grandmother passed. He lived alone in that house in Barrie for 22 years, and in all that time, his sister, my great-aunt, had almost nothing to do with him. She lived in Mississauga with her daughter, my second cousin, and they came around for Christmas maybe every 3 years, usually when they needed something. Then Grandpa Lou got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, caught late. The doctors at the RVH gave him 8 to 14 months. He made it 11. Within 2 weeks of his diagnosis, my aunt was in Barrie every weekend. Suddenly, she cared very deeply about her brother. She was bringing him soups and helping him sort through paperwork and asking, very gently, very casually, what he was planning to do at the house. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself maybe I was being uncharitable. Maybe she genuinely wanted to make up for lost time. Grandpa Lou seemed to appreciate the company, and I wasn't going to take that from him. But I noticed. The house in Barrie wasn't worth a fortune, nothing like downtown Toronto, but it was a solid 3-bedroom detached on a quiet street, fully paid off, and in the current market it would sell for somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million. Grandpa Lou had also saved carefully his whole life. He'd worked for Ontario Hydro for 30 years. There was a pension, some GICs, a modest investment account. Not generational wealth, but enough that it meant something. He never talked to me directly about what he was planning. That wasn't his way. He was private about money, old school about it. What I knew was that he'd met with his lawyer, a woman named Ms. Okafor, at a firm in Barrie, sometime in the spring before he died. He mentioned it once, casually, the way he mentioned everything. "Sorted some things out," he said. "You don't need to worry." I didn't ask more. I trusted him. That was probably naive of me in retrospect, but that's how it was. He passed on a Thursday in late October. The leaves were still on the trees in that particular way they get in Barrie before the first frost, all orange and stubborn. I was with him at the end. My aunt arrived 2 hours later. The funeral was on the Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, she had changed the locks. I found out when I drove over to water his plants. He had this enormous potted fern he'd had for 15 years, which I realize sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't, and my key didn't work. I stood on his porch in the November cold for a good 30 seconds, just trying the key over and over like maybe I was doing it wrong. I called my aunt. She didn't answer. I texted. She replied 4 hours later. "We're handling the estate. I'll be in touch when there's something to discuss." That was it. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I didn't feel rage. I felt a specific, clarifying kind of cold. Like when you're driving in winter and you hit a patch of ice and everything slows down and you become very still and very precise. That's what it was. I went home and I called a friend who works in insurance, not a lawyer, but someone who knew enough to tell me I needed a lawyer. I called Ms. Okafor's office first thing Wednesday morning. Her assistant told me Ms. Okafor was the executor of my grandfather's estate. That was the first thing I learned. The second thing I learned when Ms. Okafor herself called me back that afternoon was that my grandfather had written a will, a detailed, witnessed, notarized will, and I was named as the primary beneficiary. The house, the GICs, the investment account, nearly everything. It was mine. My aunt was not in the will at all. Ms. Okafor had been trying to reach my aunt for 2 days. I asked her, "Does my aunt know the will exists?" There was a pause. "She hasn't responded to my communications, Miss Board," Okafor said carefully. "But the will was filed properly. The estate process will proceed regardless." I thanked her and hung up and sat very quietly in my apartment for a while. Here is where I made a decision that some people, I'm sure, will question. I decided not to call my aunt. I decided not to tell her about the will, or that I'd spoken to Miss Okafor, or any of it. I decided to wait and see what she did next. Part of that was practical. Ms. Okafor was already handling it through proper channels. There was nothing for me to do legally except wait. But part of it, I'll be honest, was something else. Something I can't fully defend except to say that I had watched this woman ignore my grandfather for 20 years and then spend his last 11 months positioning herself, and I wanted to understand exactly what she thought she was doing. I didn't have to wait long. Within 10 days of the funeral, my aunt had listed the house. Not for sale yet, just a listing consultation, which I found out about because a neighbor texted me. She'd let a real estate agent in to do an assessment. She was moving fast. And then she did something that crossed a line I hadn't anticipated. She applied for a home equity line of credit against the property. I found this out from Ms. Okafor, who had been monitoring things and called me, her voice very controlled, to let me know. My aunt had submitted paperwork to a lender at one of the smaller private mortgage companies, not one of the major banks, claiming she was the sole owner of the property as part of an estate settlement. She had forged documentation. I don't know how she thought she could get away with it. Private lenders do less due diligence than the big banks, but they still do some, and the title search would have shown the discrepancy eventually. But she was moving fast, and she was betting on speed. Miss Okafor told me the amount she was trying to borrow, $220,000. "What do we do?" I asked. "I've already filed the estate documents with the land registry," Ms. Okafor said. "The title is in process, but I think we should also contact the RCMP." I asked her if that was really necessary. She said she submitted fraudulent documents to a financial institution. "That's a criminal matter. It's not optional." So that was the decision made for me in a way. What I did, what I was advised to do, was gather everything I had and do nothing to alert my aunt that I knew. Ms. Okafor handled the legal filings. I went through every text message, every email, every interaction I could document from the previous 11 months. There wasn't a lot that was overtly incriminating on paper, but there was enough to establish a pattern. There was one piece I hadn't expected: the tin of shortbread cookies. After the funeral, before my aunt had changed the locks, I had been at the house briefly to collect a few of my things, some photographs, a sweater I'd left there. In the confusion of those first days, I hadn't thought much about the tin. But then I remembered it, and I remembered how fast my aunt had moved to take it from me at the reception. Like it was a reflex, like she'd been watching for it specifically. I went back to the house. Of course, I couldn't get in anymore. But I described the tin to the neighbor, a retired woman named Heather who had known my grandfather for 15 years, and asked if she'd seen anything. Heather, bless her, had been keeping an eye on the comings and goings. She told me my aunt had taken several boxes out of the house the day after the funeral. I called Ms. Okafor and mentioned the tin. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandfather met with me in August. He mentioned he'd written a letter, separate from the formal will, that he planned to leave somewhere he thought you'd find. He didn't tell me what was in it or where exactly." A letter. In the tin. I can't prove this. I want to be clear about that. I never found the tin again. Whatever my grandfather wrote, if he wrote anything, I never read it. But sitting with that knowledge, that he had left something for me, specifically in something he knew my aunt would dismiss as worthless, I think he understood her better than he ever let on. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he left her a tin of cookies. He left her something she would take, and he left me everything else. The RCMP fraud investigation moved slowly, the way these things do. I want to be straightforward about that because I think YouTube makes it seem like legal consequences happen in a week and they don't. It took months. There were interviews. I gave a statement. Ms. Okafor coordinated with the investigator. My aunt retained a lawyer. In the meantime, the estate proceeded. The title transferred to me. I was, on paper, the legal owner of the house in Barrie. My aunt called me for the first time since the funeral, about 3 weeks after the title transfer. I don't know how she found out. Probably her lawyer told her. She called from a number I didn't recognize, which is how I know she knew I'd blocked her. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what your grandfather wanted, and I think we should talk about it as a family before things get out of hand." I said, "Things are already out of hand. You submitted forged documents to a mortgage lender." Silence. "I think you should talk to your lawyer," I said. "And I think your lawyer will tell you not to call me again." I hung up. Her lawyer did call Ms. Okafor, apparently, with some kind of proposal. I was never told the details because Ms. Okafor rightly said it wasn't a negotiation we needed to have. The estate was settled. The criminal matter was separate. My aunt's daughter, my second cousin, sent me a long message on Facebook. I won't describe it in detail except to say it covered several of the greatest hits. I had manipulated a sick old man. I had isolated him from his real family. I had produced a fraudulent will with the help of a crooked lawyer. I saved the message as a screenshot and forwarded it to Ms. N's Okafor, and then I blocked her too. The fraud charges were eventually laid. I don't know the full outcome because it was still in process when I made the decision to sell the house and move on, and I chose to stop monitoring it closely for my own mental health. What I know is that my aunt was formally charged. What happens after that is the court's business, not mine. I sold the house in the spring. The market was reasonable. Not the peak it had been a few years earlier, but solid. I used part of the proceeds to buy a condo. I put the rest in a TFSA and a FHSA, and I try not to think too hard about the money as money, because every time I do, I feel the weight of what it cost to get here. I kept the fern. Heather had been watering it since November. When I finally came to get it, on a morning in April, when the snow was almost gone and the yard smelled like mud and cold water, she handed it to me in both arms like she was handing me something fragile. Maybe she was. Grandpa Lou was not a dramatic man. He didn't tell stories about himself. He didn't explain his choices. He sorted things out quietly, and he trusted that the people he loved would figure it out. I think about the tin sometimes, about whether he knew she would take it. Was the letter, if there was one, said anything I needed to hear, or whether it just said, "I see you. I always saw you. I guess I'll never know." But I think he sorted that out quietly too, in his way. I don't chase people who treat me like I'm invisible. I don't argue with people who've already decided what I'm worth. I learned that from him. You just make sure the paperwork is in order, and you let them underestimate you, and you keep going. That's all I've got. Take care of yourselves out there. The fern is sitting in my living room right now, in the same corner. Grandpa Lou kept it for 15 years. I don't know why I'm telling you that, except that some days it's the thing I look at when I'm trying to remember what any of this was actually about. It wasn't about the house. I mean, it was practically, legally, it absolutely was. But underneath that, it was about something harder to name. It was about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you decide, somewhere along the way, that you don't count, that you're the tin of shortbread cookies, that you're the thing they can take from someone's hands without explanation and set on a counter like you were never worth anything to begin with. What I keep coming back to is the choice my grandfather made quietly, over years, without ever explaining himself to anyone. He built something. He paid off a house. He saved carefully. He sorted things out with a lawyer he trusted. He didn't do it to punish anyone. He did it because he was an honest man who believed that the right thing, done the right way, holds up. That's a kind of integrity I didn't fully understand until I watched someone try to dismantle it and fail completely. My aunt wasn't stupid. She was fast, and she was calculating, and she had been planning longer than I realized. But she made the mistake that people like her always make eventually. She assumed that because I was quiet, I wasn't paying attention. She assumed that because I didn't fight, I didn't know how to. She looked at me and saw someone she could move around like furniture, and that miscalculation cost her everything. I'm not going to pretend I handled all of this gracefully. There were nights I sat in my apartment not eating dinner because I couldn't stop running through the timeline in my head, trying to figure out if I'd missed something, if there was a version of this where things went differently. There were moments when the waiting felt unbearable, waiting for the estate to process, waiting for the charges, waiting for it to just be over. Resilience sounds like a clean word from the outside. From the inside, it mostly just feels like getting up the next morning anyway. But I also think about what it took to get to the other side of this. Not luck, not rage, just knowing who you are clearly enough that you don't need to prove it to someone who's already decided you don't matter. Just doing the next right thing and the one after that, and trusting that the truth is patient even when you aren't. Ms. Okafor told me once, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that the will was airtight. The Grandpa Lou had been meticulous. I think about that word, meticulous. I think about that word, meticulous. He was a man who checked his work, who thought ahead, who understood, maybe better than I gave him credit for, exactly what was coming after he was gone. He didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a house, a fern, and proof that doing things right actually matters. That clarity of mind and steadiness of character aren't soft qualities. They're the ones that hold up when everything else falls apart. I think that's what he sorted out, quietly, in his way.